This video will be my review of the Niner SIR9. If you're not familiar with the SIR9, it is Niner's steel hardtail. It's a Reynolds 853 steel, which I'll talk about coming up in a minute. Now, I made a video recently where I talked about why I got this bike. I got it as a bikepacking bike, so I'm getting more into bikepacking. I have a Niner RLT9 RDO, which is a phenomenal gravel bike. It has all the braze-ons that you need for bikepacking, but I wanted a hardtail for bikepacking. I wanted to get off the beaten path a little bit more, and a hardtail helps me do that. This bike, which we'll look at up close, also has all the braze-ons that I need for bikepacking. So, I got this for bikepacking. However, as I do this review, I'm going to talk about how it rides on single track, because it really surprised me. Like, I rode hardtails when I first got into mountain biking, like most of you out there. And it's been a long time since I've been on a hardtail because I just love riding full suspension on the trails. And I'll talk about the ride quality of this bike, but I'll just go ahead and say right now that it is so fun to ride on single track. Now, it's not made for, really gnarly technical downhills. You could do it, but you're going to be riding pretty slow compared to, an enduro bike. But for cross country, man, this thing is phenomenal. I don't want to get ahead of myself, so let me show the bike up close. Now, I'm not going to go through all the components, right? Because I bought this as a frame only, built it up. You can buy these as complete bikes from Niner, but I got it as a frame only. But so I want to just show kind of the frame. I will talk about a couple of components so you can get an idea of, what I'm riding. And then I want to talk about, what makes this bike so fun to ride, and just talk about the ride quality. So I'll show all the braze-ons that you get on this bike for bikepacking. So you've got the bolts on top for a top tube bag or bento box, however you want to call it. What I really like about this bike is it's got two water bottles inside the frame. You also have a place for water bottle underneath the frame, so under the down tube there, so you could carry 3 water bottles easily on this bike. And if you wanted to, you could put an adapter on the seat post and carry 4. So I really like that. It's also got the braze-ons on the back for a rack. Now, I use the Ortlieb quick rack, which you just put on those little pegs right there, and then you can drop the rack on this bike literally like in less than a minute. You just clamp it onto the seat post. But if you wanted to use a traditional rack, you do have the braze-on right there, so you can carry a traditional rack. This frame uses external routing. If you wanted to put on a dropper post, you would run the cable outside, and then as you get right there, you would put it inside the frame so you could run a seat post that uses an internally routed dropper post. One of the things that makes this bike so fun to ride is the geometry. So it's got a 68-degree head angle. I had a SIR9 many years ago, and I think it was a 71-degree head angle. They've also designed this bike to run with a 120 fork, which also increases the fun factor on this bike. Personally, I would never go with a fork below 120, even for just full-on cross-country. I think 120 is the new 100. Back in the day, 100 was the new 80. So 120 is pretty standard for cross-country, so I'm really stoked to see that Niner have built this bike around a 120 fork and put a 68-degree head angle. Now, my other cross-country bike, which is a transition spur, which arguably could be called a downcountry bike, is a 66-degree head angle. It's amazing the difference between a 66 and a 68. And I think a 68 is perfect for a hardtail. And we'll get into the ride quality of this bike in a minute, but it really just adds to the agility. I really like how the rear brake is inside the triangle there. It kind of keeps it tucked out of the way. Now, stock, this bike without an adapter, it runs a 160 rotor. If you want to put a 180, you can do that and put on a riser. Cannot go above 180 for the rear. I like 160 for this bike. Now, if I was going to get into really like mountainous bikepacking, I would put on a 180. I've got a 180, I've got the riser, but I just kept it pretty simple and just a tad lighter with a 160 rotor on the rear versus the 180. The way I have this bike set up, the cable routing is super clean because the only cable that I'm running on the frame is the brake cable. So it is set up with a wireless derailleur. I put on a 40mm stem on this bike. Number one, because I like shorter stems like a 40. I have a 40 on my other cross-country bike. Also, it's what Niner puts on their complete bike. So since they designed the bike and the geometry and run a 40, I figured it's going to work best. And I really like it. And I do have a 780 wide bar on this bike, which arguably is a bit too wide for bike packing. It's just not quite as aero for like gravel roads and whatnot. But for cross country, I like it. Yeah, a 760 would be good too. So I may trim it down just a little bit once I really start to get into bike packing on this bike. But for the riding that I've been doing so far, the 780 has been really nice. All right, so now let's kind of move into the ride quality. And I want to talk about just my experience on single track on this bike. Since it's been a while since I've ridden a hardtail, I forgot the ride quality that I like so much about hardtails, and that is how much it makes you engage in the ride. So you cannot be near as lazy and passive in your riding as you can be on a full suspension bike. Now you can ride a full suspension bike really aggressively, or you can be a little bit more slack and lazy with your lines. On a hardtail, you're forced to move the bike around more, to pick the right line, and it's just a more engaging ride. And so I have really enjoyed riding this bike, and I love steel frames. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is a Reynolds 853. So for those of you not familiar with steel, it is the top riding steel. I had a steel road bike 853, Reynolds 853, many years ago, and it was just a buttery smooth ride on the road. Now today you don't see those hardly at all, but on mountain bikes like this, man, I am just so glad Niner makes this bike. Not a lot of companies make Reynolds 853 steel bikes, and what makes the ride quality so good on this bike, number one, is the way that it just absorbs all that little trail chatter. So some bikes, especially like a really stiff carbon that's not built very compliant, like you can build carbon like to be compliant, but ones that aren't, they just ride like a board. This bike, it just absorbs all that little trail chatter, and don't get me wrong, it's not like riding a full suspension bike, absorbing bumps, but the little vibrations that get to you, it absorbs those. But also, steel is just going to flex a little bit more than carbon. Again, you can build carbon to be flexy in certain ways, but overall, the steel, it just, like when you enter a corner of this thing, it kind of just springs out of it. And so you can get into this rhythm where you're just like popping in and out of corners, and the little bit steeper head angle, the 68-degree head angle really helps with that because it's not like too slack, like like when I got on my transition spur, I was surprised at how more slack, and even just like looking at the front tire and seeing the front tire stick out compared to this. So that the front wheel is going to be tucked under the bike a little bit more, and it just makes for a really agile bike. Because unlike a full suspension, you're probably not going to be taking this thing super fast down gnarly trails. And that's why on a full suspension bike that can absorb those bumps, a slacker head angle is really important because you're just going to be going faster. But as I mentioned before, this bike forces you to really pay attention to your riding, engage in the ride, and it's just a more active riding style. And you can pin it on this bike, right? Like this is still a fairly light bike. I forgot the weight. I'll put the weight on the screen. I think it's around 26, but it's still a fast bike. And the 120 fork really, to me, is what makes this bike so good. This Öhlins fork is such a good riding fork, but any 120 fork on this bike is gonna ride great, much better from what I can remember. It's been a long time since I had my last Niner hardtail, but I had a 100 on that bike, and it allows you to hit things a little bit faster, and it just makes the front end more compliant, but yet still super agile. I love riding this bike on single track. If you hit a root in the saddle, it's going to ping you. So it just makes you engage more in the ride. Now, it's also a great training tool because I definitely notice, and this is just hardtails in general, right? I definitely notice my legs are more tired, but that's a good thing, right? I mean, we ride to be in shape and to get stronger and faster, or just be more, just to be more healthy. And so, like, getting out of the saddle over bumps versus relying on the suspension is going to use your leg muscles more, and so it is going to just, I think, improve your fitness. Now, for racing, I'll just be real honest with you. I would choose full suspension. I am faster on full suspension, but fast isn't always what the name of the game is. When you've been riding full suspension for so long, this is just different, and I have found myself choosing this bike more than I thought I would getting out on the trail. Originally it was just going to be a bikepacking bike that I maybe rode on single track every once in a while, but there are so many days where I was like, I'll ride the SIR9. I'll ride the steel hardtail because it's just a different ride than a full suspension bike. So if you're getting bored of your cross-country full suspension and you just want to mix it up a little bit, especially like me, like if you ride the same trails all the time, because like most of us, we have a local trail system that we end up riding most of the time because we just don't want to drive a long way, which is fine, right? I've got 35 miles of trails, right? So I'm not complaining, but this just mixes it up, which I love. It makes the old trails different. So yeah, as you can tell, I'm really digging this bike. Any questions or comments, drop those below. If you've ridden a SIR9 or any steel hardtail, let us know your thoughts. Do you agree with me? All right, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do so for all kind of videos on mountain biking and gravel riding. And with that, I will catch you in the next video. Thanks for watching.